So update 45 just dropped, and I haven't started making my usual video where I go over all of the balance changes, because I've sat here all morning thinking about and doing some calculations on one of the changes in particular, and that is the change to temples. If you look at the version history for temples, you will see that that tower hasn't really gotten anything but bug fixes for the past 3, 4, 5 years. And that's pretty insane when you consider that BTD6 gets an update about once every 2 months. And in the balance changes, almost every single tower gets some form of change every single update. So to have one tower that has gone unchanged for years and years is pretty crazy. Now, for some reason, I feel like this is a good thing, like the Temple and the True Sun God. I feel like those kinds of towers are ones that shouldn't receive balance changes very often, so I do think it's good that they don't get that, but this change, I feel, was about time. So let's begin by reading what Ninja Kiwi had to say and then take a look at the actual balance changes. Quote, "We haven't looked much at temples since the release of other paragons." I'm not sure why they say other paragons. Temples are not paragons. Are they referring to the VTSG? I don't know. Anyway, we haven't looked much at temples since the release of other paragons, as these have solidly carved out a place for themselves in boss events. The original temple has fallen behind. We wanted to try to make this work again by improving upon the weaker temple sub-attacks. With increased power, we have also reduced the basic attack pierce gained on the main temple attack. We will be reviewing temple balance further soon, so if any of your feedback on this rules, capital R, that must be a wordplay on my name, we'll then take that under consideration for our next look. So let's take a look at these changes one at a time, starting with the Magic Sacrifice attack. One of these is called the Magic Arcane Blast, and the pierce for that one has been doubled, while the damage has also been doubled for each of the 3 different tiers of that attack. Next up, one of the attacks that you gain for the primary sacrifice, the Golden Glaive attack, has now been given 5 times the damage for all 3 tiers of the attack. Also, another primary attack that you gain, the Golden Blades that shoot out in all directions, has been given a 10 times pierce increase and also a 10 times damage increase for all tiers of the attack. So those were some pretty crazy buffs, but there were some nerfs too. If we take a look at the primary pierce buffs, you'll see that the 4 stages of pierce buffs has been reduced. So initially you would gain 5 extra pierce for every level, but now you gain 2, 2, and then 3 and 3. So instead of maxing out at 20 additional pierce, it now maxes out at 10 additional pierce. So the max pierce has now been cut in half. So that's pretty brutal, and it doesn't stop there. The military pierce buffs in the 3 levels that it comes in has also been reduced from 15 to 10, so a 33% reduction in the maximum possible pierce from the military sacrifice. Now, the temple is a really complex tower. There's an incredible amount of different attacks and different tiers to each and every one of those attacks, and it can give different buffs, and different sacrifices synergize differently with different other sacrifices. So reading all of this, it can be pretty damn difficult to understand how much of a buff is this really. And that's what I've been sat here doing all morning. I've basically been writing down the damage and attack speed for all of the different attacks, pre-update and post-update, and I've been trying to get all the variables in check to understand how much stronger this will really make the temple. So let me go ahead and show you my calculations, but before that I want to tell you that we are assuming here that we're dealing with a single target. So we're talking about single target damage, and we're gonna circle back to the pierce buffs because they're pretty significant towards the end of the video, but for the calculations we're assuming a single target that is Moab class. Also, by the way, there is a new item you can purchase in the shop called the Fast Track Pack, which allows you to start 1/4 the way into the round count on any map. So for example, if you're playing Impoppable, you're gonna start on round 25 with all of the cash that you usually would have at that round. And this is useful because that means you can grind black borders a lot quicker, and also whenever there is a collection event, that means you can get a lot more points to open more boxes a lot faster. So get your wallet and spend all your money using code MacandRules. Thank you very much. So the first thing we have to do is we have to calculate the damage output for every single attack and add them up pre-update to take a look at how much damage the temple does per second before the update. Oh, and we're also assuming that this is a temple that is a 1110, so that's max sacrifices in primary, military, magic, and nothing in support. Buffs and debuffs we're going to take into account later on. So first of all, the main attack with max primary sacrifices does 10 damage every 0.036 seconds, so that's 27.78 attacks per second, and that times 10 is 278 damage per second. Sticking with primary, the Golden Blade does 25 damage and shoots out 8 of them once every 1.5 seconds, so that's 133 DPS. Also primary, the Golden Glaive used to do 30 damage every 0.5 seconds, so that's 60 damage per second. Moving on to military, the Golden Missile shoots 1 per second and does 75 damage, or actually 1 damage, but an extra 74 to Moabs, and we're assuming Moabs here. Military also gives you the Golden Spectre, or actually 2 of them, that does 25 damage every 0.15 seconds, so that's 333 DPS. Now moving on to magic, the Arcane attack used to do 35 damage and shoots 6 shots at the same time, once every 2 seconds, so that's 105 DPS. And lastly, the Mini-Sun avatars. They do 4 damage each and attack once every 0.03 seconds, and you can have a maximum of 3 of them per temple at the same time. Their lifespan is 65 seconds, and they spawn in once every 30 seconds, so you will have 3 at the same time for 5 seconds, followed by 25 seconds of having 2 on the map, so 2.17x should be about right, and that's 289 DPS. So that puts the old temple at a total of 1273 damage per second. Now, if we do the same calculation for the new temple, that yields us 2818 damage per second. Now, as you first see that number, you'll probably go, holy crap, it's more than twice as strong. But again, we do have the Pierce nerfs to take into consideration later on, but still, more than twice as much single target damage? There must be something wrong here. And indeed there is something wrong here. There is 2 more things that we need to take into account. And one of those things is the Golden Blade attack. That was the attack that was given the biggest damage increase by 10 times. That particular attack shoots out 8 blades in all directions and is not seeking. So that one attack, in contrast to all the others, is going to miss a lot of the time. These calculations we did assumed that every single shot hits. Now, of course, that's true for everything else, but not for this particular attack most of the time. So, given that it was given a crazy buff, assuming that all of the shots hit when they don't, is going to cause things to get out of proportion. So, instead of assuming that all of them hit at all times, let's go with an average of less than 50% and say that 3 of them hit on average. So the total DPS adjusted for the Golden Blade attack missing is now 1190 and 1985 damage per second respectively. But there is one more thing that we need to take into account, and that's buffs and debuffs. When you have a tower that is this expensive, you almost always give it all the buffs possible, and you also have all of the debuffs possible on the map. Both damage that is added through debuffs or buffs such as Acidic Mixture Dip or those from the True Sun God gets added once per attack. So if you have a fast attacking tower that does low damage, that will do a very big percentual increase, but for attacks that don't attack very quickly but do large amounts of damage, that's not going to be a very large increase percentually. And the reason why this is so important for us to take into account here is that most of these buffs were given to attacks that don't attack very quickly but do a lot of damage. So as we buff this tower, these new attacks, or not new attacks, but the ones that has been buffed, are not really gonna become a lot stronger. But all the other attacks, such as the main attack or the attack from the Minison avatars, they are gonna get a lot stronger. So these buffs will sort of get drowned out a little bit by all the other stuff once we apply the buffs. So if we once again go back to assuming that all of the attacks hit and we run the numbers with all the buffs, we will end up with 3,519 DPS for the old tower and 5,064 DPS for the new tower. And finally, if we assume we have all of the buffs and we're also taking into account that a lot of the blades are going to be missing, we will end up with 3,376 damage per second for the old temple and 4,171 damage per second with the new temple. So let's take a look at the percentages. If we were very naive, we would have assumed that this was a 121% damage increase, but then when we adjusted for the blades, it was already down to 67%. If we assumed we have maximum buffs, it was down to 44%, and if we assume both of those things, we are down to 24%. Now this number sounds a lot more reasonable than the initial 121%, and especially if you take into account that we haven't yet looked at all the Pierce nerfs. So let's now talk a bit about the Pierce. We did see a Pierce increase in the Magic Arcane Blast attack as well as the Golden Blades attack. So that's pretty nice, but in general the Pierce has been nerfed, because the primary sacrifice now maxes out at an additional 10 Pierce instead of 20, and the military Pierce maxes out at 10 instead of 15. So if you calculate the maximum possible damage output, that's taking the DPS times the Pierce, have we gotten an increase or a decrease? I don't really care, because that number I don't think matters that much for this particular tower. I think I prefer having more single target damage, because most of the times when you use this tower you're going to have a lot of buffs to increase the Pierce anyway. So most of the time you probably won't even miss the Pierce that you lost, but are there any situations in which you might? Well, here I guess there are a few different situations. If we're talking about regular easy mode late game on an easy map, then no, this Pierce is probably not gonna bother you any, because you're gonna have so many Pierce buffs and you're gonna have a lot of towers that take care of everything below bad, so you would probably prefer the new temple for the additional damage towards single target. The situations in which this Pierce nerf could potentially affect you negatively would be if you're playing a easy mode late game challenge on a very difficult map, or you're playing a challenge in which you are very limited, so that temple has to take care of most of your bloons anyway. And I guess also if you're doing chimps mode and you're going for a temple, I guess the early game, I'm not sure how much Pierce is required, but I do remember that it was a bit of a problem when I was going for the chimps record, so it may affect you there as well. Now, since I made my latest big late game videos on easy mode and chimps mode, as I mentioned before, there has been some new strategies that has evolved, which is basically centered around ninjas instead of temples. And now with this update, some people in the Discord were wondering, well, does this mean that the meta will now be to go back to temples instead of ninjas? And some people were talking about potentially running some sort of combination strat of Chinooking the ninjas into the temple footprint sort of strategy. But I can't say that I have a definitive answer on that, because, well, it's only the first day of the update and I've never even run a full ninja strat late game myself, so that question I think is going to take a little longer to answer, and I think I'm probably gonna leave that up to the other hardcore late game guys in the Discord. But to go ahead and summarize this change to the temples, overall, yes, it is a buff, even if you take into account the Pierce nerfs, because most of the time you won't be bothered by that Pierce nerf anyway, so the single target damage you gain is definitely worth it, and it lands at about 24%. I'm sure there's some more things you could probably take into account to get that number even more exact. I'm just rushing this together in a couple of hours so I can upload this the first day of the update. So in case you think of anything more, make sure to put it in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.